Welcome to A Year of War and Peace. I'm your host, Brian E. Denton. A Year of War and Peace is a daily, year-long, chapter-by-chapter reading of and meditation on Leo Tolstoy's epic novel, War and Peace. In these videos and podcasts, you'll be treated to a free reading of one chapter per day of the novel, plus a reflective essay I've written individually tailored to that day's chapter. These readings are offered for free, though if you'd like to support me, you can do so in one of three ways. First, you could purchase my ebook, A Year of War and Peace. It features the entire novel, plus all of my reflective essays, and it's only $2.99 on Amazon.com. You could also become a patron at patreon.com/BrianEDenton. If you sign up there, you'll receive a sonnet once a month, plus a link to an ebook of my collected sonnets. Finally, if you like, you can make a one-time donation to my PayPal account. The email there is brianedenton@gmail.com. You can also use that email to contact me. I'd be happy to hear from you. Your support is greatly appreciated.
Today's reading and reflection is on Chapter 242. Chapter 242. Before 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the Rostovs' 4 carriages, packed full and with the horses harnessed, stood at the front door. One by one, the carts with the wounded had moved out of the yard. The calash in which Prince Andrew was being taken attracted Sonia's attention as it passed the front porch. With the help of a maid, she was arranging a seat for the Countess in the huge high coach that stood at the entrance. "Whose calash is that?" she inquired, leaning out of the carriage window. "Why, don't you know, miss?" replied the maid. "The wounded prince. He spent the night in our house and is going with us." "But who is it? What's his name?" "It's our intended that was, Prince Bolkonsky himself. They say he's dying," replied the maid with a sigh. Sonia jumped out of the coach and ran to the Countess. The Countess, tired out and already dressed in shawl and bonnet for her journey, was pacing up and down the drawing room, waiting for the household to assemble for the usual silent prayer with closed doors before starting. Natasha was not in the room. "Mamma," said Sonia, "Prince Andrew is here, mortally wounded. He's going with us." The Countess opened her eyes in dismay and, seizing Sonia's arm, glanced around. "Natasha?" she murmured. At that moment, this news had only one significance for both of them. They knew their Natasha, and alarm as to what would happen if she heard this news stifled all sympathy for the man they both liked. "Natasha does not know yet, but he's going with us," said Sonia. "You say he is dying?" Sonia nodded. The Countess put her arms around Sonia and began to cry. The ways of God are past finding out, she thought, feeling that the almighty hand, hitherto unseen, was becoming manifest in all that was now taking place. "Well, Mamma, everything is ready. What's the matter?" asked Natasha, as with animated face she ran into the room. "Nothing," answered the Countess. "If everything is ready, let us start." And the Countess bent over her reticule to hide her agitated face. Sonia embraced Natasha and kissed her. Natasha looked at her inquiringly. "What is it? What has happened?" "Nothing, no." "Is it something very bad for me? What is it?" persisted Natasha with her quick intuition. Sonia sighed and made no reply. The Count, Petya Madame Schoss, Marva Kuchemina, and Vasilievich came into the drawing room, and having closed the doors, they all sat down and remained for some moments silently seated without looking at one another. The Count was the first to rise, and with a loud sigh crossed himself before the icon. All the others did the same. Then the Count embraced Mavra Kumichevna and Vasilievich, who were to remain in Moscow, and while they caught at his hand and kissed his shoulder, he patted their backs lightly with some vaguely affectionate and comforting words. The Countess went into the oratory, and there Sonia found her on her knees before the icons that had been left here and there hanging on the wall. The most precious ones, with which some family tradition was connected, were being taken with them. In the porch and in the yard, the men whom Petya had armed with swords and daggers, with trousers tucked inside their high boots, and with belts and girdles tightened, were taking leave of those remaining behind. As is always the case at a departure, much had been forgotten or put in the wrong place, and for a long time 2 men-servants stood one on each side of the open door, in the carriage steps, waiting to help the Countess in, while maids rushed with cushions and bundles from the house to the carriages, the calash, the phaeton, and back again. "They always will forget everything," said the Countess. "Don't you know I can't sit like that?" And Dunyasha, with clenched teeth, without replying, but with an aggrieved look on her face, hastily got into the coach to rearrange the seat. "Oh, those servants," said the Count, swaying his head. Efim, the old coachman, who was the only one the Countess trusted to drive her, sat perched up high on the box and did not so much as glance around at what was going on behind him. From 30 years' experience, he knew that it would be some time yet before the order, "Be off, in God's name," would be given to him. And he knew that even when it was said, he would be stopped once or twice more while they sent back to fetch something that had been forgotten. And even after that, he would again be stopped, and the Countess herself would lean out of the window and beg him, for the love of heaven, to drive carefully down the hill. He knew all this, and therefore waited calmly for what would happen, with more patience than the horses, especially the near one, the chestnut falcon, who was pawing the ground and champing his bit. At last all were seated. The carriage steps were folded and pulled up, the door was shut, somebody was sent for a traveling case, and the Countess leaned out and said what she had to say. Then Efim deliberately doffed his hat and began crossing himself. The postilion and all the other servants did the same. "Off, in God's name," said Efim, putting on his hat. "Start," the postilion ordered the horses. The off-pole horse tugged at his collar, the high springs creaked, and the body of the coach swayed. The footman sprang onto the box of the moving coach, which jolted as it passed out of the yard onto the uneven roadway. The other vehicles jolted in their turn, and the procession of carriages moved up the street. In the carriages, the calichet and the phaeton all crossed themselves as they passed the church opposite the house. Those who were to remain in Moscow walked on either side of the vehicle, seeing the travelers off. Rarely had Natasha experienced so joyful a feeling as now, sitting in the carriage beside the Countess and gazing at the slowly receding walls of forsaken, agitated Moscow. Occasionally, she leaned out of the carriage window and looked back and then forward at the long train of wounded in front of them. Almost at the head of the line, she could see the raised hood of Prince Andrew's calichet. She did not know who was in it, but each time she looked at the procession, her eyes sought that calichet. She knew it was right in front. In Kudrinyo, from the Nisitsky, Princa, and Porovinsky streets, came several other trains of vehicles similar to the Rostovs. As they passed along the Sadivanya street, the carriages and carts formed 2 rows abreast. And they were going around the Sukharev water tower. Natasha, who was inquisitively and alertly scrutinizing the people driving or walking past, suddenly cried out in joyful surprise, "Dear me, Mamma, Sonia, look, it's he!" Who? "Look, yes, on my word, it's Bezukov," said Natasha, putting her head out of the carriage and staring at a tall, stout man in a coachman's long coat, who from his manner of walking and moving was evidently a gentleman in disguise, and who was passing under the arch of Sukharev Tower, accompanied by a small, sallow-faced, beardless old man in a frieze coat. "Yes, it really is Bezukov in a coachman's coat, with a queer-looking old boy. Really," said Natasha. Look. "No, it's not him. How can you talk such nonsense?" "Mamma," screamed Natasha, "I'll stake my head it's he. I assure you. Stop, she cried to the coachman. But the coachman could not stop, for from the Meshiatsky street came more carts and carriages, and the Rostovs were being shouted at to move and not block the way. In fact, however, though not much farther off than before, the Rostovs all saw Pierre, or someone extraordinarily like him, in the coachman's coat, going down the street with head bent and a serious face beside a small, beardless old man who looked like a footman. The old man noticed a face thrust out of the carriage window gazing at them, and respectfully touching Pierre's elbow, said something to him and pointed to the carriage. Pierre, evidently engrossed in thought, could not at first understand him. This guy. At length, when he had understood and looked in the direction the old man indicated, he recognized Natasha, and following his first impulse, stepped instantly and rapidly toward the coach. But having taken a dozen steps, he seemed to remember something and stopped. Natasha's face, leaning out of the window, beamed with quizzical kindliness. "Peter Kirillovitch, come here. We have recognized you. This is wonderful," she cried, holding out her hand to him. "What are you doing? Why are you dressed like this?" Pierre took her outstretched hand and kissed it awkwardly as he walked along beside her while the coach still moved on. "What is the matter, Count?" asked the Countess in a surprised and commiserating tone. What? Don't ask me," said Pierre, and looked round at Natasha, whose radiant, happy expression, of which he was conscious without looking at her, filled him with enchantment. "Are you remaining in Moscow, then?" Pierre hesitated. "In Moscow? he said in a questioning tone. Yes, in Moscow. Goodbye. If only I were a man, I'd certainly stay with you. How splendid, said Natasha. Mamma, if you'll let me, I'll stay. Pierre glanced absently at Natasha and was about to say something, but the Countess interrupted him. You were at the battle, we heard. Yes, I was, Pierre answered. There will be another battle tomorrow, he began, but Natasha interrupted him. But what is the matter with you, Count? You are not like yourself. Oh, don't ask me, I don't know myself. Tomorrow, but no, goodbye, he muttered. It's an awful time. And dropping behind the carriage, he stepped out into the pavement. Natasha continued to lean out of the window for a long time, beaming at him with her kindly, slightly quizzical, happy smile. All right, that concludes my reading of chapter 242. I will now proceed to my reflection of the same. A Year of War and Peace, day 242. Old Ephem's Sufferance. Iago, that motiveless malignity, cloaks his deceptions in the garb of good sense and sound advice. So while he is eager to set into motion his scheme against Othello, he counsels wise patience to Rodrigo, a pawn in his plan. How poor are they that have not patience, Iago cries. What wound did ever heal but by degrees? Thou knowest we work by wit and not by witchcraft, and wit depends on dilatory time. This is counsel we all, the Rostov family in particular, would do well to accept. Things are looking pretty bad for the Rostovs at the moment. They're in the middle of a devastating evacuation. Emotions are running high. The Countess, true to character, is a confused mess. When Sonia brings her news that Prince Andrew is among the dying wounded in their cart caravan, she becomes even more worried, confused mess. Natasha, for her part, is some combination of nervous and joyful excitement. She's at once invigorated by the sense of adventure born of the evacuation, and also the positive role she has played in persuading her family to help the wounded soldiers. Who knows what direction her notoriously mercurial mood will yank her once she learns that her beloved Prince Andrew is among the wounded dying soldiers. She'd do well to emulate Efim, the old Rostov coachman. Having learned from years of experience to be patient when dealing with the Rostovs, he remains calm in the face of their perpetual tardiness and disorder. The man doesn't even glance behind him to see what is causing today's delay. He merely sits high up in his carriage box and, with noble forbearance, awaits the order to start the drive out of Moscow. So the next time you find yourself in a troubling circumstance, just remember old Efim and his indifference to and acceptance of situations he has no control over. Daily Meditation. Well then, and have you not received faculties by which you will be able to bear all that happens? Have you not received greatness of soul? Have you not received manliness? Have you not received endurance? And why do I trouble myself about anything that can happen if I possess greatness of soul? What shall distract my mind or disturb me or appear painful? Shall I not use the power for the purposes which I received it? And shall I grieve and lament over what happens? Epictetus, The Discourses. All right, that concludes my reading of and reflection on chapter 242 of War and Peace. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks so much for joining me. Remember that if you'd like to support me, you can do so either by purchasing the ebook, A Year of War and Peace, becoming a patron at patreon.com, or making a one-time donation to PayPal. The links to all that are down below in the show notes. Tomorrow we're going to be reading and reflecting on chapter 243. I hope you'll join me. Until then, take care of yourselves and others.